Pierce was born December 28, 1953 in Worcester, Mass. 6 months earlier, his mother hid in the basement as a massive tornado leveled his future hometown of Shrewsbury. The effect of prenatal imprinting is still being debated in medical circles, but a connection does not seem implausible. He's a 1975 graduate of Marquette University, although he has long family ties to both BC and Holy Cross. At Marquette, he majored in journalism and brewery tours. He could have majored in that at BC, I think, but no. He was delighted to combine his vocation and his avocation once again when he returned to Milwaukee to cover the trial of Jeffrey Dahmer. He attended graduate school at Boston College for 2 weeks. I think in political science, although he's not exactly sure. He's a former forest ranger for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and still ponders the question of what possesses people to go into the woods and throw disposable diapers up into trees. There's a theme here. You'll see how all of these things have led him to be prepared for today's talk. He began his journalism career writing bowling agate for the Milwaukee papers and remains justly proud of his ability to spell multisyllabic, vowel-free Eastern European names. He's written for the alternative press, including Worcester Magazine and the Boston Phoenix, and was a sports columnist for the Boston Herald. He was a feature writer and columnist for the late limited sports daily, The National. He's been a writer-at-large for Men's Fashion Magazine, and his work has appeared in the Boston Globe, New York Times Magazine, LA Times Magazine, and the Chicago Tribune, among others. He appears weekly on National Public Radio's sports program, Only a Game, and is a regular panelist on NPR's game show, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, and is a frequent host on ESPN Radio. Since July 1997, he's been a writer-at-large for Esquire, covering everything from John McCain to the Hubble telescope, with more than a few shooting stars thrown in between. I think that may apply to both Hubble and John McCain. In April 2002, he joined the staff of the Boston Globe Sunday magazine. He's a recipient of numerous professional awards and honors. On several occasions, he was named a finalist for the Associated Press Editor's Award for Best Column Writing, and it has been suggested that if only he would wear a tie, they might have let him have the award. In 2004, he was the recipient of the National Headliners Award for his profile of Ted Kennedy. He was a 1996 National Magazine Award finalist for his piece on Alzheimer's disease, entitled In the Country of My Disease. And he has expanded this piece into just a wonderful book entitled Hard to Forget, an Alzheimer's Story, published by Random House. And it's for that work that we were so pleased to invite him and to have Charles Pierce join us today. It is a wonderful book that combines both scientific writing about the basic research into the genetics of Alzheimer's disease with a clear capacity to convey the stark and telling impact on families of this dreaded disease. Mr. Pierce tells me he also has every copy ever printed almost in his garage. If you haven't had a chance to buy this, please see him afterwards. He is available. It's with great pleasure that I bring you Charles Pierce. Please join me in welcoming him as he talks to us about Hard to Forget, an Alzheimer's Story.
Thanks, Mick. Thank you to everyone involved in the conference, everyone at BC, Kathy, Jean, wherever you are. Thank you. I'd like to point out that to all researchers in the audience that DNA samples are available after my talk. Please bring your own swabs. I'd like to thank again everyone for allowing me the honor of speaking here today. This is the most recent of a number of these talks that I've given since the publication of Hard to Forget in May of 2000. And I'm always gratified by the number of people who are willing to come out and listen and hear the story of my family's ongoing encounter with Alzheimer's disease. I usually begin with a joke, one of the first Alzheimer's jokes anyone ever told me back about 20 years ago when nothing about the disease seemed very funny at all. It's an audience participation piece, so let's all sharpen up, okay? Are you ready? Here it is. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Very good. It's always better to work a sophisticated room. You should count yourselves lucky, though. I gave a talk in Louisville once, and that went on through 15 repetitions before anybody got it. begin by telling you a story about how I once went to church with Deion Sanders, the famous football player. I was writing a profile of Deion for Esquire, and as part of the research, I was allowed to go with him to the Potter's House, a huge megachurch near Dallas run by the Reverend T.D. Jakes, who has become a rather well-known television preacher, albeit a wonderfully eccentric one. For example, the Reverend Jakes advises against the purchase of satin sheets because it will be difficult to, quote, gain purchase, unquote. To which all may say amen. And just as an aside, while I was in Dallas, Nightline called my house to see if I wanted to be on a segment they were doing about Alzheimer's. They tracked me down at my hotel. Alzheimer's may have a great reach, but it's got nothing on Ted Koppel. Anyway, the Reverend Jakes took as his text this particular night a passage from the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark, in which Jesus cures a man with leprosy, and as a result, he and his apostles cannot go openly into any town. They had to pray outside the camp, intoned the Reverend Jakes, as the building itself seemed to rise off the ground with the Spirit. I found myself that night thinking about what a famous Alzheimer's researcher had told me during the time I was working on Hard to Forget. He worked in a lab, but he also worked in a clinic. He told me that he could not do... Should I tell the joke again for these guys? He told me that he could not do the former work if he did not do the latter. He did not want to see Alzheimer's merely as an intellectual puzzle to be solved. He wanted to see it as an adversary to be defeated. And he could not see it that way under a microscope. He could not see its power there. No matter how finely he calibrated his instruments, he could not gauge the destruction it could do. There was no periodic scale of human tragedy. To see these things, he had to see them in the eyes of the people in the clinic, and in the eyes of the people who had driven them there, in the eyes of the children, young children and old children, who sat holding their hands and murmuring assurances. To see the disease whole, he had to leave the lab. He had to walk away from pure science. He had to leave its antiseptic precincts and enter the messy, entangled world that Alzheimer's forces upon all its victims. To appreciate the work he was doing, he had to go and study outside the camp. Because we are the people outside the camp. Estimates say there will be 14 million people with Alzheimer's by the middle of this century. This means that there will be 3 or 4 times that many directly affected by it. We are the ones who care for the 7 in 10 Alzheimer's patients who live at home. We are the ones who pay for 75% of the care provided for Alzheimer's patients at home, an average of $12,500 per year per patient. We are the ones who sleep with one eye open and who do not sleep nearly enough. We are the ones who steal the car keys, remove the controls from the burners on the front of the stove, and in certain areas of this great land of ours, hide the shotguns. We are the ones who make the big decision. We decide to treat our loved one as they are, not as we wish they were. If our decorated war veteran father decides he is comfortable carrying a stuffed bunny, we allow him to do that. If our brilliant pianist mother has taken to wearing her shirt inside out, we determine not to fight that battle every day. We are the ones who do not allow a family illness to become a family curse. We're the ones who drive the vans and serve the meals and gradually feel our worlds closing in until we can barely breathe. We're the ones who look for the facilities. We're the ones who cling to dignity, hanging on by a thread. We're the ones who work so very, very hard not to lose ourselves along the way. We're the ones that get depressed. We're the ones that get exhausted. We're the ones that go bankrupt. We're the ones that, God help us, wish in the deep darkness that our loved one might die. We're the ones who find it somewhere in ourselves to get up the next morning and do it all over again. Remember us in your laboratories. We're the ones outside the camp. Let me tell you about a few of us. Let me tell you about Cordelia Davis, a shy woman in North Carolina whose parents were both diagnosed on the same day. They brought her mother in. They told her the diagnosis. They were leaving. The whole family turned right. Her father turned left. The doctor said maybe you should bring him back now. Let me tell you about Olga Jones, a tough former Army nurse who ran a support group in a small town not far from where Cordelia Davis lived. Olga ran it until she couldn't run it anymore. She found Alzheimer's a tougher opponent than the North Koreans ever were. Cordelia herself fought the disease, and when her parents had both passed, she fought it some more, developing a formidable speaking style until this very shy woman is now a star on the Alzheimer's lecture circuit. And let me tell you about me. 20 years ago this spring, in the small town in central Massachusetts where I was raised, my father went to the flower store to buy geraniums to plant on the family graves, both in that town and in Worcester. It's a small town, and they were digging up the center of it, and they put up a detour. My father turned right and kept driving until his car ran out of gas 3 days later in Montpelier, Vermont. My father died 3 years later. Since then, Alzheimer's has taken all 4 of his siblings. Last summer, his only sister died, and she was the last of them. Over those 20 years, I've seen remarkable progress. The difference between the quality of life my father enjoyed and the one enjoyed by his sister was epical. The new therapies were a godsend. She was able to carry on an amiable conversation long past the point in the disease at which my father had gone mute. Moreover, the horrible sense of isolation has so dissipated since the day my father went missing. Back then, my wife couldn't find a listing for the Alzheimer's Association through directory assistance. She spoke to the state police, and they told her, well, sometimes men this age run off with their secretaries. My father was as likely to have done this as he was to have flapped his arms and flown to the moon. It is unthinkable today that Alzheimer's would not be the first thing that occurred to a state trooper upon being told a 63-year-old man had disappeared in his car. The Safe Return program would have been activated. Even in the popular culture, Alzheimer's profile has been raised. I often talk about an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, in which Mr. Spock's father is afflicted by a Vulcan variation of Alzheimer's. It manifests itself in uncontrollable bursts of telekinesis. Vases and glasses and jars fly around the badly painted surface of Vulcan. A radius of chaos develops around the entire patient. And that radius of chaos is what I thought made Alzheimer's Alzheimer's, even several dozen light years away. There is rejoicing outside the camp more than I've ever seen there. There are new therapies and there are even greater scientific breakthroughs coming. But there are breakthroughs also in the sociology of the disease that are equally as profound. There is a community of the disease, and it talks to itself, and it talks to the outside world. The people in it do not feel alone. They feel that they have some power over the disease, if not for themselves and their loved ones, then at least for the ones that will come later. We learn how to take things personally. We learn how to read a newspaper. I know that I can spot a story about Alzheimer's with my peripheral vision now, way over at the far edge of the page. I read them all. Knowledge is not only power, it is solace too. I know I can spot a story about Alzheimer's buried deep in a story that is on the surface, not about Alzheimer's at all. I read a story about the Congress of the United States passing a bill that makes filing for personal bankruptcy more difficult. And in it, I see that the average lifetime cost of caring for an Alzheimer's patient is $174,000, and that 3/4 of that come out of our pockets. I see the story within the story. I read a story about handing Social Security over to the stock market, to the money managing industry, and in it I see there will be 14 million Americans with this disease in the middle of the next century. I read a story about the politics of stem cell research, and I see in it my father. At the end of the couch, from which he rarely rose, pulling out his teeth with his fingers because his teeth were hurting him, and he couldn't tell us anymore that he was in pain. I did not then, I do not now see the hand of God in that moment. I believe it was a terrible manifestation of an impersonal disease that we damned well ought to cure if we can. I do not believe that God makes people suffer to prove a point. I believe he has a son for that. And that is how we read the newspaper now, outside all the camps, outside the camp of the scientists and the ethicists and the politicians, outside of the spin, outside of the camp. For us, the great debates are not about calculation or triangulation. They are not about clever strategies or deft maneuvers. For us, the debates are deathly serious, the stakes real and mortal. For us, we have lost faith with flights of theological fancy, with exercises in, and may my late uncle, Father Michael G. Pierce, S.J., forgive me, Jesuitical debate. These are not angels on the head of a pin. These are living human beings on a sofa, fading as we watch, a perpetual wake before an inevitable funeral. And some of us bite down hard on our anger. Can any cure be worse than this disease? Convince us. We ask for honest options. We ask for all the honest options. We can make our own decisions, settle matters with our own God. We ask for the truth, as much of the truth that science can supply us. We examine our own consciences because we come to our hard decisions through raw experience. Almost 8 years ago, I embarked on a journey through what I called the country of my disease. At that point, I dreaded growing old. I had 3 children, and I dreaded their growing old as well. I found the bravest people I ever met. In that country, what looked at first like a desolate landscape came to appear to me wondrous, with blooming hope. Since then, I've grown more optimistic. We seem to have this monster surrounded, and we have many of you to thank for that. I cannot do more here today than to remind you that you do have a constituency, that there is a spark of the divine in what you do, as surely as there is one in any church or any temple. That spark can warm you and warm us, if faith is set against reason or fear against hope. And if you doubt it, come see us and know that we are there waiting outside the camp. Thank you. And now we can talk. And I'm willing to answer whatever questions there are. The gentleman in the tie right here.
What do you think the impact of our current extensions of the lives of Alzheimer's victims is on the caregivers, the people left around?
I can only measure it, and I will measure it my own experience with my aunt, who was diagnosed 4 years ago now, I think, and was in a facility in Worcester, not far from where she and my father grew up. And I know that there's a great peace in the ability simply to communicate longer. The worst thing about my father's manifestation of Alzheimer's was that there was significant involvement of those centers of the brain that control affect. In one way, it's a blessing because it guaranteed that my father would not have a violent episode, which my Uncle James had several of. But what it did was it made my father go flat. Almost autistic. I have a friend with an autistic son, and it was virtually the same thing. My Aunt Mary was capable of talking about her. In fact, we picked up some information about the old days, literally until the month before she died. And I think it allows, the therapies now allow the person, it allows the caregiver to attach to the person. It doesn't force upon you, this awful feeling that the person is fading away, the person is disappearing before your eyes. And you can maintain a contact with the way the person was. Now, as I said in my talk, and I learned this from somebody who's been working with this disease longer than I have, one of the worst things you can do, I think, is to treat a person with Alzheimer's as though they were the person they were. Because 9 times out of 10, you're doing that for yourself. You're not doing it for them. I mean, like I said, if your Marine Colonel father wants to carry a stuffed bunny, you're being embarrassed. He's not being embarrassed. It makes him feel good. Let him carry it. Let your mother, as long as your mother is not going to a formal wedding, let her wear a shirt inside out. Who's it hurting? It's hurting you. And if you force people, I think prior to the new therapies, when at my father's point, there was an awful temptation to try to live out your hope through the patient, which is unfair. One of the things that people have learned a lot about Alzheimer's, at least I have, it's not happening to you. It's a disease. It has symptoms. Heart disease is a disease. It has symptoms. Parkinson's is a disease. It has symptoms. Alzheimer's is a disease. It has symptoms. One of the symptoms is the person who has it may not recognize you. You may not recognize them. My wife never knew my father when he didn't have Alzheimer's disease. They had a terrific relationship. He thought she was the greatest thing. In fact, when he disappeared in Vermont, my wife tells the story much better than I do. We went up and got him, and on the way home, my wife was pregnant with our second child at the time. On the way home, we stopped at McDonald's to eat, a fast food lunch. And my father had developed these wonderful strategies for coping that Alzheimer's patients do. he had my wife, he was very polite. The one thing that's interesting about my dad is he never lost his manners. Whatever was ingrained in him as a youth about his manners, he kept. And so we sat down. We all got the McDonald's placemat menus or whatever. And the server came up and happened to ask my father, "What would you like, sir?" First thing he did was point to my wife and say, "Oh, let her go first." The server would have no idea my father was an Alzheimer's patient. He was just a gentleman. My wife orders. She comes to my father. She says, "What do you have, sir?" He says, "I'll have what she's having." Excuse me. It's an extraordinary piece of coping right there. He doesn't know what he's looking. He doesn't know where he is. Doesn't know who we are, except we seem to be nice little folks who are buying him lunch. So we sit down, and now, stupid me, I decide to make a conversation with my dad. He doesn't know who I am. I'm a nice little guy who's driving his car home for him. So I say, "Dad, Margaret's going to have a baby." My father gets this horrified look on his face. What were we accusing him of? He just met this woman. He's halfway out of the restaurant before we could convince him to just sit down and eat his lunch. Now, my wife handled that with wonderful aplomb. I fell apart. I drove home and fell apart. Because I wanted him back the way he was, and the symptoms of his disease wouldn't let me have that. I didn't know that at the time. I think the one thing that the ease that the new therapies bring to the caregiver is that you don't feel like you're falling off that cliff as often as you do with back with I measure it between my aunt and my father because they were the two poles of the disease. My father was the first one to develop it, the first one to die. My aunt was the last. And we're talking a difference between 1985 or 1986 and last year. And I just thought that I think my aunt was a lot happier. And I think because she was a lot happier, we were a lot happier.
I really appreciated the litany that you offered at the beginning of your talk. We are the ones who don't get the sleep. We are the ones who, and so on. And I would like to ask you to say a little bit more about the burdens on the caregivers, many of whom are women, and it's a big issue for many of us women that there is so much unpaid care work that we are so dependent on women who often do this unpaid care. So will you talk a little more about what it takes to care for patients with Alzheimer's who remain at home?
That question goes in so many different directions. First of all, not only are a lot of the caregivers women, a lot of them are elderly. A lot of them have their own health problems. A lot of them have their own lives to live. My mother, I can once again relate it to my own story, my mother refused to acknowledge that my father was ever ill. And because part of the story of In Hard to Forget is my inability to confront that myself and my father, and the fact that my father did not have a quality of life he should have until far too late. I found out after my father had gone into Newton Wellesley Alzheimer's facility that these kind of episodes, not quite as graphic as driving to Vermont, but these huge manifestations have been going on for 3 years before he disappeared. I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea they were going on. My mother shut down. My mother had a very Depression-era baby Irish Catholic view of mental illness, which was, my father the way she put it was, my father had gone crazy on her. And my father had done something to her. First of all, he hadn't gone crazy. I'm not a doctor, but that's not a real clinical term. But she was never able to get over that. I think you're dealing with women, as I said, many of whom are elderly themselves, who are confronting an almost impossible burden. My mother was lucky in the sense that my father was neither violent nor wakeful. My father slept. My father would get up in the morning, sit on the sofa, and stay there. She didn't. We changed the locks, but we didn't really have to. We got the car keys away from him. My mother couldn't drive. Another thing. But basically, we learned gradually from the neighbors that my mother had gradually been isolating herself from all her old friends in the neighborhood, and they never knew why. Long before my father had any serious manifestations. Yeah, I think aside the financial burdens, which are, as we know, considerable, I think the idea that we ignore the notion of somehow subsidizing visiting nurses and home health care is an absolute scandal. That is, I mean, this is literally, to me, like denying penicillin for whatever, for pneumonia or whatever, denying antibiotics. The one thing you can do to help with Alzheimer's and to help the collateral damage that this disease inevitably causes is to give people respite. Give them an hour a day. This place that I talked about, Olga Jones, this woman literally worked in a MASH unit in Korea, ran this thing way out in the country in North Carolina. She's the one who told me, by the way, that the biggest problem with Alzheimer's patients in rural North Carolina is not getting the car keys, it's getting the shotgun. And she had social workers go up to a cabin and were greeted at the door by an Alzheimer's patient with a loaded shotgun, which is the single most terrifying thing anyone told me about the disease. But she had these things, she had this bus that would go around to small towns, little towns way out in the tobacco field, pick up the patient, bring him to the center, and they were there for 4 hours, a couple times a week. I took the bus, I drove the whole route with the two ladies who drove the bus, all volunteers, nobody's getting paid for anything. I think Olga was she was drawing a huge Army pension because she retired as a major, but she was also getting some kind of stipend from the local mental health organization, whatever it was. Nobody else was getting anything. The two women driving the bus, no money. We're driving around. If you could see the faces of the wives or the husbands as they put their loved one on the bus and knew that for 4 hours they weren't going to be on watch. It was the most incredible mix of happiness and guilt I've ever seen. I don't know if these people didn't just go back in the house, shut the door, and go to sleep. A remarkable number of them were dressed they dressed up to meet the bus. A remarkable number of them already were clearly going to get in their car and go have their hair done, or go see a movie, or go be human in some way. But I just remember that the bus took about 40 minutes between, it took about, it was from 6 till 9, it was 3 hours to do the whole route. Sometimes it was 40 minutes between stops. There wasn't a single person who left their loved one who didn't look like that. And I thought, and this is literally for some of them 1 day a week. The group they called it the Friday group. It happened on Friday afternoons. I don't know what they did the rest of the week, but to see these people out in the middle of nowhere, completely isolated, just having this 3 or 4 or 5 hours where they could be themselves. It once again emphasized to me that one of the primary symptoms of this disease is the destruction it does in people who don't have it. And the only therapy for that is to give people time to catch their breath and give people time to be human.
Can you say anything about the legal problems that can come in the earliest phases of the disease? I speak from experience. We had a next-door neighbor, a woman who'd been a grants manager for the government, and in front of our very eyes, and I guess using some of the coping mechanisms that your father used, she developed Alzheimer's and ended up signing off some papers for somebody that essentially gave away her house and got her into some financial problems.
Yeah.
And we felt terrible because we didn't recognize. I'm a physician and I'm supposed to know about these things, and I didn't see it happening until it was too late almost.
You make an excellent point because they're really good at it. I mean, one of the great things I'll get to your point in a second. One of the great things that's happening now is the programs by which various Alzheimer's associations are allowing people who are in the very early stages of the disease and just been diagnosed to come out publicly and discuss what it's like. I was on a panel show on television with a chemistry professor from MIT who had been diagnosed maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month earlier. And he talked about, well, I could do this, this, and this. I can't do this. I probably can't teach after September. We're doing less and less of hiding the early stages of the disease. The problem is they do it. And as you said, that woman probably could have walked into this room right now and nobody would have had it. Sometimes on that stuff you just have to get lucky. With family members, if you get the diagnosis, while they can sign their names, have them do what they have to do. Keep very careful watch on who they're talking to. I know for a fact that there are, unscrupulous, boy, that's a kind word, marketing folks who work that population with the assumption that a certain percentage of these people will have some sort of cognitive difficulties. My aunt was on the mailing list of every crazy organization in America because she sent $100 to, I don't know, I think it was the National Life League or something, but all of a sudden she's sending checks to everybody. My aunt, in one of the great manifestations of the disease in my time, sent money to the Pope. Now, she didn't write checks to, Catholic charities, and she didn't, write checks to Catholic Children's Relief or whatever. She sent cash to the Pope. John Paul II, Vatican City, Rome, $8.50. She's sending the guy his beer money. But there are, as you say, there are people who pitch to elderly. We all know this. There are a lot of elderly people who buy aluminum siding that they don't need. But part of the calculation is that a certain number of these people will be able to sign their names without knowing what they're signing. And unless you've got family do the hard stuff. That's what we didn't do with my dad. We did it with my aunt, but we didn't do it with my dad. Do the hard stuff. Take the keys away. Get the power of attorney. If he cuts you off, it doesn't matter. He's not going to remember it in a year. Do what you have to do to keep him safe. Do what you have to do to keep you safe. But as you said, a lot of it's luck. Obviously, there was no one that this woman could turn to and say, no, you don't want to sign that because basically you don't know what you're signing here. And the people who are alone, and there's an awful lot of them, they can be helpless. And I think that we are better. Okay. That's okay. I think we're getting better at it. I think that, as I said, the concept of the sociology of the disease is much better than we were. The Safe Return Program is something that I couldn't have dreamed of when my father disappeared. My father wound up in the drunk tank because they didn't know what to do with him. He was standing outside the state capitol in Montpelier in the rain, and his car was out of gas, and he couldn't tell him where he was from, and he couldn't tell him why he was there. And if you're a street cop in the middle of the rain in Montpelier, Vermont, you're going to assume the guy's drunk, so you put him in the drunk tank. That would not happen today, I don't believe.
One of the, I think, really interesting and important aspects of your book is your very artful weaving of the history of the search for the genes that govern Alzheimer's. And Alzheimer's, as a genetic disease, raises a whole new set of issues that other diseases don't. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, as you do in your book, about what it means for you as the son of someone with Alzheimer's. I'm speaking as a person who has a child with a genetic form of mental retardation, who's writing a memoir. I looked at your book. Your book is just, everyone should buy it. It's really...
Well, I'll get in the bus and go to my garage. I'll sell them. Give them out like party favors at this point. So.
But I see it as a model. I'm writing about genetic disease.
Sure.
And one of the things that I'm being forced to look at in myself is my own identity in light of the fact that I carry the mutation of the gene. It's Fragile X syndrome. It's a trinucleotide repeat disorder like Huntington's.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder if you could speak a little bit, and I know it's a really painful subject, obviously,
No.
but you do raise it in your book about your own vulnerability. And again, genetic diseases are in a whole different ballgame. You can't say it's us and them.
Okay.
You know.
Interestingly enough, and I think optimistically again, my book is out of date in terms of genetic science
It happens.
because it keeps going,
Yeah.
and I knew it would be. Interestingly enough, though, we had my aunt's genetic material tested. By the time my father died, there was barely a genetic link, and it was only to early onset, and my father pretty plainly didn't have that, so we didn't test him. Now it gets weird. My Uncle Jim died over the 4th of July weekend. They couldn't get a coroner, so we lost him. My Uncle Thomas was a priest who died in Rhode Island father, Michael, was a Jesuit, and if anyone knows the society, you don't get to say very much. My aunt died, so we said, we're going to get some genetic material. We're going to send it to Peter Hislop in Toronto, and we're going to test it. So, no problem. So we take the stuff, and they get the stuff. My friend Dan Pollan, who works at UMass Med School, who's my father's doctor, sends it to Peter Hislop, this just brilliant geneticist at the University of Toronto. No markers. Not a single one. All 4 siblings, not a single genetic marker in my aunt. None of the presenilins, none of the ApoE genes, none of the ones that are directly or indirectly involved with the disease. Where do we go? All right, that's my story. Genetic disease, as we know, it's going to have more time than we have here today. The big question is, do you recommend being tested? My answer to that has always been, what are you going to do if you know? There are therapies you can undertake now. There are diet regimes you can undertake. There are things you can do now. There are more things you can do now than when my father was diagnosed. It is a strange and wonderful field in so many different levels. From the legal aspects to the very, very serious issues of genetic privacy, which we are not doing anywhere near enough about. The one thing that I remember a geneticist telling me is society and culture and politics and the law and ethics have got to shape up, because we're not going to stop. They're going to take their science and throw it. And if we're not out there to catch it, if the rest of society isn't there to deal intelligently with it, we're going to have some serious problems. I think we've moved. There was genetic privacy legislation. There's the ongoing debate that I touched upon briefly and I think kind of tangentially about stem cells. It is important. It is imperative for an involved citizenry now to get informed about this, and not just the people with the disease. The people who are paying the money to try to get rid of the disease should know. It can haunt you. I know, the first person I remember being haunted by this was Arlo Guthrie, who spoke openly and honestly about worrying whether or not he would develop Huntington's. And I remember seeing an interview with him when he passed the zero barrier, where he likely wouldn't get it, and he threw a concert and he had a party. But I remember thinking, about that and thinking, wow, certain mornings it's supposed to be awful. What do you do? As I say in my book, what do you do the first time you forget where your car's parked? It's different in my family. It's different now that I'm completely confused because my aunt didn't have any of the markers. But basically, with Alzheimer's, I can't speak to the disease that you're experiencing and you're writing about. The only thing you can do if you have it in your family, I think, is to maintain your own optimism, because it really is surrounded. There really has been some remarkable progress on it. And if you want to be perfectly mercenary about it, it's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for genetics research. If somebody figures out how to turn this disease off, the Nobel Prize is going to be the least of their wall hangings. They're going to make a lot of money. There are ramifications to that go everywhere. We get a cure, who's going to be able to afford it? How do we parcel it out? Do we have suspect and non-suspect populations? All of that. But basically, I think it is incumbent upon people with genetic disease in their family to acquaint themselves with all the issues they might have to face. Because the one thing you don't want is you don't want to get caught short. You don't want to get caught by surprise. You don't want to get blindsided by something you didn't think about. Luckily, there are now genetic privacy, lawyers who specialize in areas of genetic privacy. There are disease organizations, the Alzheimer's Association, the Huntington's Association, that sort of thing, where you can go and get directed to whatever. They're one-stop shopping for all your needs on this. I remember quoting somebody in my book who's saying that every disease now has a pressure group. And he was speaking not entirely favorably about it, but I think if you count as pressure groups, organizations where people who can't get answers can get them, I certainly have no problem with that. Am I worried about getting Alzheimer's disease? I'm less worried about getting it than I was, and am I worried that I will get it? I am less worried about what may happen if I do, because I know there are things in place because I've seen them.
With the advent of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, there's now a test you can run on in vitro blastomeres for ApoE, and I think
301, I think. I'm not sure, but
I think so. Anyway, then that means the family has the option of learning about if markers are there or not prior to the onset of a pregnancy. Could I put you on the spot and have you comment on the biology, the efforts, etc. of that?
well, what I can speak for me. I would have no problem with that, because by the time that child, remember how special Alzheimer's is, by the time that child even gets to the early stages of early onset, there are going to be therapies that will guarantee, I think, that Alzheimer's will be something like diabetes. I think at the very least 50 years from now, we'll have a treatment that causes the disease to be chronic and not catastrophic. Now, if you want to talk about other genetic problems and other, things that might be more severe, might onset earlier in life, boy, that's an individual conscience thing. And I would, in consultation with my wife, in consultation with my clergy, I can't for the life of me give you an answer on that. But Alzheimer's, it's 50 years before you have to worry about it. That sounds cold and pragmatic and a little bit utilitarian, but that's the way I feel. I think with Alzheimer's disease, within 50 years, we will have at the very least, a therapy that will keep you alive, perhaps amiably forgetful, until you die of something else.
This is a question about Jesuit education and
Wow.
Alzheimer's.
The Jesuits never forget anything.
Depends what they like. You went to a Jesuit university. You had an uncle who was a Jesuit. Could you say something about the pluses and the minuses? What was it in that background, if anything, that gave you something to work with in your involvement, your family's involvement with Alzheimer's, and what do you wish they'd given you that they didn't?
Well, I went to Marquette University, which is a Jesuit institution by the shores of a Great Lake in Milwaukee. Because I went to journalism school, I didn't have many Jesuits. But luckily, because the Jesuit school was so terrible, I needed to get so many courses to graduate, I had to go take them somewhere else. So I took a lot of theology, and I had to take a lot of theology, and I had to take a lot of history, and I did manage to fall into members of the society that way. I think that beyond the Jesuit education, I learned most from my uncle, who was, he taught at Holy Cross, he was Dean of Men here for a while. He was the fundraiser for the Jesuit seminary guild for many years. And he was the most insatiably curious human being I've ever met in my life. I don't know what they do, but at some point in the development of a Jesuit, I almost said manufacture. At some point in the development of a Jesuit, they inculcate these people with an enormous desire to know everything. So he would, when I was a kid, my other uncle was a doctor of sacred theology, very much into theology, but his interests were not as wide-ranging. My uncle, Michael, was interested in everything. He would bring me books. I would write him what I was taking in history class, and he would say, well, why don't you read this guy? And, why don't you, And I think I had a professor of European history who, he was not a Jesuit, who said, there are only three things you have to know about European history. The nobility is always corrupt. The middle class is never ready to take control. And the Jesuits are always being expelled. I think it's that curiosity that got him in so much trouble. But I think that I took that curiosity and applied it when I went to college. I wanted to go. My parents were very happy that I went to a Catholic college. It didn't matter much to me. I just happened to apply to all of them. I had great good fortune to turn Notre Dame down, which I'm very proud of. But I think it was that kind of insatiable intellectual curiosity, and I think once you get that instilled in you, it causes you to challenge even those preconceptions that the Jesuits put inside you in the first place. And I think that more than the Jesuits, the Sisters of St. Joseph created the writer, at least by insisting that I get the techniques down, that I know how to make a sentence. Anybody here can diagram a sentence? Look, nobody under the age of 50. Look at that. I still can't diagram a sentence. I can write one. I can't diagram. My diagram sentences always look like the Erie Lackawanna Railroad. They look, I have the dependent clause up here, and then this would go down here, and the verb would be over here, and it would look awful. But I do think that the one thing that the Jesuits and my Uncle Michael in particular told me is to learn the basics, and then you can fly on your own wings from there.
This past flu season, we faced a formidable challenge because of the shortage of the vaccine. And some of the very difficult discussions that we kind of initiated with operators of Alzheimer's units and extended care facilities, et cetera, had to do with how, in the instance where you have a shortage of vaccine, you try to distribute it to those that maybe have some quality to their lives and some hope for interacting with people. As you know, there are any number of individuals that have had significantly progressive, fairly rapidly progressive dementia that almost has no quality to their lives, and some are in a persistent vegetative state. And it gets to be a very difficult and at times a real ethical dilemma of how one distributes those doses. How would you deal with something like that, having had your experience?
Assuming it were my family member and I had a choice, or if a doctor came to me and said, your loved one is in such a state that we could probably do better using this vaccine on someone else. You have 2 patients in 1 vaccine, let's say. I can relate it a little bit to my father's death. My father began in June of 1989 to develop a series of pneumonias, which is not uncommon in Alzheimer's. I mean, my grandmother used to call pneumonia the old man's friend, and I realized later that the reason they called it that was that people who had Alzheimer's generally would die of pneumonia. I learned later as I was doing the book that there are millions of people buried under death certificates right now that say pneumonia that are probably were Alzheimer's patients. He got a pneumonia, and we took him to Newton Wellesley Hospital, and he got better. Got another one, treated it, and got better. So at that point, I got on an airplane, and I went to fly to New York to cover the Belmont horse race. So the day of the Belmont, I'm in the press box, accomplish my investments for the afternoon. And the phone rings in the press box. The phone almost never rings in the press box. And I get paged. And it's my father's primary care from Newton Wellesley saying, he's got another pneumonia. Do you want us to treat it or not? And I didn't blink. I was astonished by how easy the decision was. I said, no. I said, let him go. And I was, to this day, I'm amazed that it was that I could do it as quickly as I did. I swear to God, the next minute the race started. The bell went up, the horses took off. Strangest day of my life. But I would like to think, and I certainly can't answer, this is one of those questions that's wonderful in the abstract. I certainly would think that were I the loved one or the caregiver of the person who is in the vegetative state, and there was a person whose quality of life was still pretty high and was responding to Aricept or whatever, that I would give up the shot. But I do not envy anyone who has to make those kind of decisions, especially the medical people, because so much of it can go so back and forth against what they're trained to do.
Could you tell me, what is the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's, and does dementia lead to Alzheimer's?
Now, some clinician here is going to tell me I'm wrong, but as I understand it, Alzheimer's is a specific form of dementia. Dementia is sort of the baggy word that covers multi-infarct dementia, Pick's disease, X, Y, and Z. Alzheimer's is a specific disease with a specific etiology and a specific symptomology that people are still fighting about. But Alzheimer's, I guess the easiest way, Alzheimer's, I believe, is a form of dementia, whereas there are a number of others.
Get it?
B plus? Thank you. Thank you, Dr. I appreciate that. It's been so long. I had to reread the book a little bit because I haven't dealt with this material in a long time. Alzheimer's, there are, and I don't know how many of them there are now, but there are several markers for early onset Alzheimer's. My understanding is that almost all early onset Alzheimer's, which is by far the minority of cases, are genetically connected. There are markers that indicate a predisposition to late onset Alzheimer's. They're not definitive, but these are specifically toward Alzheimer's disease. Obviously, multi-infarct dementia involves strokes and stuff, but my understanding is that almost all forms of early onset dementia, or early onset Alzheimer's, there we go, are genetically linked. And there's also a theory that I've talked to people about, that the possibility is that one day we may have different kinds of Alzheimer's. We may have Alzheimer's A, B, and C the way that we have hepatitis A, B, and C. I don't know where the research is on that at this point.
My question is specific to choices, and you mentioned that you took away the keys and you took away the checkbook, not too bad. When do you feel that it was time to take away the keys, to take away the checkbook?
Well, when my father tried to go to the flower store and wound up in Vermont, was an indicator why we took the keys away. Get the things they can sign while they can still sign their name. That's the other thing. If you want the power of attorney, make sure they can still sign their name. If you have a large family, have meetings about this. Make sure everyone is on the same page, or there isn't somebody in the family who's, luckily I'm an only child, there isn't somebody in the family who's going to challenge what you're doing. Living wills are a terrific idea, by the way, in this regard. But while they are still, let them do what they need to help themselves while they're still capable of doing it. Because if you wait too long and the signature is a garble, you're going to get trouble from lawyers, you're going to get trouble from siblings, maybe you're going to get trouble from your parents or your uncle's family. I mean, it's not a guarantee, as we learned in my family, it's not a guarantee that everybody's going to be on the same page with this. So the best thing to do first is to coordinate everybody, and then to move while you can move. And you can hide the keys. I mean, you could literally take the keys and put them in a drawer. The person's never going to find them. You can, one of the interesting techniques they teach you is you never say no to an Alzheimer's patient. Yeah, because it doesn't matter, it's a meaningless concept. You say, it's also, by the way, the same thing they teach you in Santa Claus school. I went to Santa Claus school. And they teach you in Santa Claus school never to say yes or no to a specific present, because then you put mom and dad on the spot. Santa says they're getting, the G.I. Joe with the Kung Fu grip, and they don't get it, then mom and dad are in big trouble and Santa's a liar. So what you say is, Santa will see what he can do. That's the term of art in Santa school, for all of you looking for another career. With an Alzheimer's patient, never say no, never say yes. Say, okay, we'll see about it, why don't you wait here. Now, 5 minutes later, they're going to ask you the same thing. Give them the same answer. 10 minutes later, they're going to ask you the same thing. Give them the same answer. It's easier, if you say no, they'll get angry or they won't understand the concept. I have it in my book, an anecdote with a guy named David Fagans, who was one of the members of Olga Jones's Friday group, the respite group. And we were together. He was the last one. His wife was coming to pick him up. And he was the last one to be picked up. So it was he and I in the room. And he kept saying he was going to go get the car. And I said, okay, wait here, I'll bring it around. Sat down next to him. We went through this, it's like the knock-knock joke. We went through this 15 times. All 15 times, he said, I got to get the car. I said, you wait here, I'll bring it around. Sat down. It's maddening. It can make you crazy. But it makes the person feel comfortable. You're not putting them on the spot. You're not getting them angry. You're not causing them to have emotions they don't really understand anymore. What you're doing is you're getting through that 5 minutes. And then you get through the next 5 minutes. Sooner or later, his wife showed up. He got in the car and went home. But the one thing, again, this goes back to don't treat the person like you wish they were. That person may well be gone. Treat them like they are. Treat them like a person with a disease. And one of the ways you treat this disease is to be as kind as you can and be as realistic as you can to who they are at the moment.
Question probably in the back of the mind of everybody who's gotten to be my age is, you get the diagnosis. Use a bridge abutment? Or what?
No, I don't think so. I would hope that you might be become one of those people who goes out and talks to folks. Those are the most valuable people we have in the community right now. I have it, I'm out here, I look just like you. I probably can't drive my car anymore, but I can still walk down the street. I can probably still see a movie. I can try the new therapies, I can volunteer for whatever's coming down through the pipeline. I can be part of the cure, I can be a yellow fever volunteer in the Panama Canal Zone, except I can do it in my living room. It's a scary disease. It's in its own way, it's a wonderful literary disease because it attacks all of those centers that make people who are writers writers. It attacks memory, it attacks language, it attacks the concept of self. So in a lot of, there is Alzheimer's lit now. There are a number of plays involving Alzheimer's with Alzheimer's characters. There are an infinite number of TV shows that have had from Law and Order to Family Ties who have had Alzheimer's plot lines. Because it's a very compelling, there are so few diseases that directly ask you, who are you? And I will take away who you are. Are you defined by what you know about yourself? Are you defined by what other people's perceptions are you? I'm not philosopher enough to deal with most of this, but it's a disease that profoundly attacks the sense of self, in which case it's not only terrifying, it's enormously powerful in kind of a storytelling sense.
Talk a little bit about the process that you went through in writing the book. When during the course of your father's illness did you decide to write the book? And tell us a little bit about that.
I was driving home one time with my wife down Route 9 from Worcester, and she said, "You ought to be taking notes about this." And I said, "I'm not taking notes about this. I hate this. I want this to be over." So my father dies, and in 1993 or 4, where I was having a meeting at GQ with my story editor, David Granger, who's now my editor at Esquire. And we started talking about genetics. We need to do something about genetics. This is the way magazines work. We have to have something about this. And they said, I said, one thing I could think of doing is finding a family who has a genetic disease. And how do you cope with this kind of sword of Damocles hanging over your head? And David said, "Well, do you have any in mind?" And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact." So I wrote a magazine piece. And I went to a lot of labs. I reconstructed the events of my life and my father's life as best I could. And I wrote the magazine piece, and it got shortlisted for the National Magazine Award, at which point a couple of people, Doubleday and Random House, said, "Hey, there might be a book in this. Why don't you see what you can do?" So as the Wizard of Oz says, times being what they were, I took the job. And that's the way it happened. But I remember vividly, in the middle of my father's disease, being absolutely horrified by the notion that I would sit down and relive all of this again. One of the interesting things about the process of writing was I had to interview everybody in my family. I do not recommend this to anyone going into journalism. Interviewing your family is a real pain in the neck. I interviewed my son Abraham, who was the oldest one and the one who was most directly affected by these events. My son Brendan was a baby and doesn't remember much. But Abraham remembered all of it. And I had a 4-hour interview with him. I still remember in a dining room in a rainy day where I just let the tape recorder run. And he just sort of, all the stuff I didn't even remember, all the stuff that he never told us, all the stuff that the experience he had had with it. My wife and I fighting, why do we have to go to this awful house with this crazy man? Why is my mother why was my mother reacting the way she was? Why do I have to spend every Sunday in this lunatic asylum out in Worcester? So that was the process of writing, and basically the book took the template from the magazine article. It was trying to weave the personal story and being caught up because of your personal circumstances and all this high-end science. And I learned a lot more from the science, obviously, but I learned a lot about myself doing it too.
Did you have any experience with hospice programs at end of life or the?
Not with, as I said, my father was at Newton Wellesley in an Alzheimer's unit at a point where where Alzheimer's units were not that common, because there are obviously certain requisites for that don't exist in nursing homes. My uncle died at home. My uncle Michael died at the Jesuit retirement home in Weston. The unit there is now named after him. And my uncle Jim died at a hospital. But no, we didn't have any experience with hospice care. I wish we had, but no.
I know there's research going on involving the autopsy of brains with Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, curious as a family member, how you would feel.
I love it. Donate your your brains, absolutely. If you have Alzheimer's patients in your family, they don't need them, donate the brains. I've actually seen my father's brain slides, which are fascinating because you can see I don't know if you've ever seen a slide of an Alzheimer's brain tissue, but it looks like, I always compare it to, it looks like the photos you see of Dresden after World War II. There's these burned out areas, these black areas, and you can see the damage, the radius of damage from the cells. I had a very wonderful experience with a group of nuns out in Wisconsin while I was writing the book. They had been part of a longitudinal study based in the University of Kentucky. The School Sisters of Notre Dame, and part of their deal is that when they enter, they have to write an autobiography of their entire life up from the time they enter the convent. And nobody throws any of these away. They save them all. They have every single one, including the woman who founded the order. And what they found, they did a very interesting thing where they discovered that if the nuns who wrote in complex sentences, the ones who wrote in these, and not in those, seem to hold off the onset of Alzheimer's longer, which has a little bit to do, I think, with a concept that I use in my book, where when I got panicked about having the disease, I would start remembering anything I could, triviality. Who shot McKinley? Who was the three-headed dog at the gates of Hades? Who won the National Football League MVP in 1963? And I discovered that it had a name. It's called mental flossing, which I thought was clever. And the principle is that if you exercise your brain, you can hold off to an extent the development of the disease. And now it has something to do with these nuns. So anyway, I met a woman named Sister Helen Repke, who had been a chemistry professor. And one of the things about the School Sisters of Notre Dame is they are required, most of them, to get graduate degrees, which is very unusual at the turn of the last century. But anyway, Sister Helen Repke was walking around, and she was showing me, this is Sister who was a painter, this is Sister who taught fine arts at wherever, and this is the Sister who was a physicist. And we're walking toward the elevator, and she said, look around you. And I said, yeah. She said, pretty good brains here, don't you think? And I said to her, do you guys have any qualms with, giving it up after you're dead? And she said, no use for it. And I think that it's enormously important for research to have the brain bank. There's one at UMass. There's a very big one at the Bryan Center at Duke. Yes, I am. Do I have any ethical qualms about donating my brain after I'm dead? No.
When you talk about therapies, are you mainly talking about Aricept and dementia, or are you talking about other therapies?
Well, unless those are the ones that I've had experience with only because those are the ones my aunt was on. Subsequent to that, as I said, since my aunt died, I've fallen out of touch. But my aunt was on Aricept, and it seemed to have a terrific effect on her, and not a lot of side effects that we could tell. It kept her clear. She was able to, as I say, converse. She was able to make sandwiches for the people on her nursing home. I remember the early days of Cognex, right, was the one cycle before. The early days with that, I remember people having terrible trouble with that. She seemed to take to this very well. Subsequent to that, I have no experience because I don't have anyone directly involved.
How involved were you in the decision making of your father's siblings? Was there a lot of contact, consulting?
They all had Alzheimer's disease. There was no contact. We were a very isolated bunch of folks. We had this kind of Irish reserve. There were dynamics in my father's family that I can't begin to understand. But I do remember this one time at my Uncle Jim's funeral. My two uncles who were priests, my Uncle Father Tom and my Uncle Father Michael, who was the Jesuit and worked here, were on the altar, along with 7 other priests, kind of celebrating the Mass. And I looked up, and my Uncle Tom and my Uncle Mike collided. They both turned the wrong way. Now, priests don't forget how to say Mass. Any more than you forget how to ride a bicycle. And that was like, they had this incredible tableau. My father was dead, my uncle was dead in the middle of the aisle of the church, and my 2 uncles were banging into each other on the altar. My Uncle Tom then, see, my friend Joanne Koenig-Koss told me it's always good to laugh, so I'll tell the story because it's very funny. My son Brendan was maybe 7 at the time my Uncle Jim died. So he comes up to me at the graveyard and says, "Daddy, why is that man chasing me with his thumb?" I said, "What do you mean he's chasing you with his thumb?" And he points to my Uncle Tom. My Uncle Tom is trying to bless my son. He's not sure why. Brendan has no idea what's going on. So I look up, and my Uncle Tom, who weighed about 260 pounds, is chasing my son, who is hiding behind tombstones, going like this. And I said, "Well, Brendan, it's because he has, I think, what Grandpa had." But I just remember that they weren't a factor at all. My aunt tells a very poignant story about my Uncle Michael not being able to give my Uncle Jim last rites, because he couldn't remember them. He did come and give my father last rites, and he got through it all. And at the same time, again, this is the kind of thing that you pick up only afterwards. After he gave my father last rites out of Newton Wellesley, he said, "Come on down to the parking lot, I got something for you." I said, "Okay." So I went down with Michael, and he opened up the trunk of his car. He gave me a case of beer. I thought a Jesuit had a case of beer in his trunk. I said, "Where'd you get this?" He said, "I have no idea." So, as I say, we're not a factor, shall we say. It was pretty much done. I mean, my uncle, obviously the Jesuits took care of my Uncle Michael. We didn't have a lot of input there. My aunt, who just died last summer, and my Uncle Tom lived together in Rhode Island. They pretty much cut the rest of the family off. My Uncle Jim was being taken care of by his wife and his 3 children. So there wasn't a dynamic between the siblings at all. I wonder if there ever was one. Yeah, sorry.
I was wondering, there's an argument against stem cell research that is basically about giving families false hope. And I was wondering that if for Alzheimer's, because of the nature of the disease, that argument is even weaker.
I saw something recently that seemed to say that of all the possibilities of stem cells, Alzheimer's is probably not the best. That there are probably other diseases for which it shows more promise. That was disappointing. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that you don't do the research because it might fail. Alzheimer's families, at least in my experience, aren't looking for false hope. They're looking for any hope. They're looking, don't come to us and tell us we're not going to do this because it might not work. Do it. If it doesn't work, we're okay with that. But don't not do it because it might not work. Don't do it if you have ethical qualms about it, that's another thing. But don't come to us and give it, that's what I said when I talked about give us honest opinions. If you don't want to do this work because you have an ethical problem with it, tell us that. We can respect that. Don't come to us and tell us we're not going to do this because it might not work anyway. We don't have time, Alzheimer's family don't have time for absurdity. And that's the kind of thing that I would think. I did, as I say, read something that said that Alzheimer's is probably not the disease that would be as whatever to that as some others. But
Charlie, when your dad was diagnosed, you were simultaneously a son and a father. And you talked about Brendan's reaction at your uncle's funeral and also interviewing your other son.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how that continues to play out with your sons and whether you talk with them about the disease?
yeah, a little bit. Brendan's very interested in it now. He's a sophomore at Brandeis, and he's interested in everything, but he's also interested a lot in ethical issues and religious studies. So he's interested in the concept of genetic privacy and And I tell them that the only thing you can tell anybody with this is to keep informed. Read the newspaper, spot the story over here. Talk to your members of talk to your legislators, talk to the people around you, talk to other people with disease. If you call the Alzheimer's Association, you're credit. But whatever you do, don't live your life under a cloud. I mean, it's Brendan's not even 20 yet. He's got nothing to worry about. They've all been real good about it. Abraham, of course, is my stepson, so he has no genetic connection to my family. So he's sort of this kind of outside observer. He took the brunt of the effect the disease has on the family, but he has no genetic connection to it at all. So.
You said that when your Uncle Michael came down with the disease, that the Jesuits pretty much took
It wasn't real good, but there wasn't anything we could do about it. I mean, they really do, you really do sign up when you join the society, as they say. I mean, were there better places for them? Probably, but there wasn't anything we could do. The fact that they do have a specific pavilion out at Weston now dealing with Alzheimer's, I think, is a good sign. They probably should have a few more of them. The priest, as we know, the priest population is getting older. But I think that, I think they did as best. I think there are some things that I think they may have drugged him a little more than I wanted to. They may have kept him in a chair more than I wanted them to. But I think that, by and large, they were doing it, by their own lights. I mean, as I say, I remember he always said that when he was in seminary, his father was diagnosed. My grandfather, who I never met, died in 1945. He had lymphoma. And they gave Michael two choices. He could come home to visit him while he was alive, or he could come home for the funeral, but he couldn't do both. And that's the kind of discipline that he lived his life under. And I don't think he would have wanted to be outside the society when he passed away. So I think, by and large, we did right by him. Nick's standing up again.
Time for one last question.
One more?
How strong is the genetic component and percentage-wise?
Oh, man, somebody's gonna have to help me on this one. I know that the genetic component on early onset is almost exclusive. On late onset, that's up in the air. It's subject to an enormous amount of debate. There doesn't seem to be, somebody, go.
Well, I think you hit it right on a little bit earlier when you said that Alzheimer's is going to turn out to be more than a single disease.
Right.
It's probably 6 or 7 different diseases we now put under a single basket because we can't tell them apart. And for some of them, the genetic component is going to be very strong, and for others, it's probably environmental.
Which is why there's a lot of money involved in researching this disease, which is why I'm very optimistic, because it has ramifications that goes in enormous different directions. I think I'm right, though, that most early onset is now considered to be genetic, right?
Right.
Well,
Thank you very
Charlie.
much.